actually gave my first book talk at Aspen about a year and a half ago, and I've totally changed it. So if any of you heard that, it's totally different. But I appreciate that. I appreciate being here. Walter did me the great honor and service of reviewing the book for Amazon, which set off some of the other reviews nicely. And anyway, I see a lot of familiar faces out here. And since I know many people in the audience, I know you didn't come here to hear me speak. You came here to hear yourself speak. So I'll try to be brief and let the soliloquies begin. Like many people in this room, I spent a lot of time around politicians. When I got my current job at the Times about 7 years ago, Robert Novak gave me a good piece of advice, which was to interview 3 politicians every day. And I don't always do that, but I try to meet that quota. And from spending so much time around politicians, I can tell you they're all emotional freaks of one sort or another. They have what I call logorrhea dementia, which is they talk so much they drive themselves insane. But what they do have, as many of you know very well, is they do have phenomenal social skills. When they meet you, they lock you into their gaze. They invade your personal space. I often talk of a Republican senator I had dinner with a couple of years ago, kept his hand on my inner thigh the whole meal. Actually, I was up at the Kennedy Library last night, and I reminded of seeing Ted Kennedy at the well of the Senate many years ago, and he greeted Dan Quayle, and I was up in the press gallery up there, and they hugged, and they were laughing, and their faces were like this far apart, and they stayed hugging and laughing, and their arms were running up and down each other's backs, and they were sort of grinding away there, and I was like, get a room, I don't want to see this. But that is the social abilities they have, and obviously the most famous is Bill Clinton, whose social abilities were legend. The one story I tell about him, I was in a Boston hotel room a couple years ago now. I'm walking through the lobby, Clinton comes out of the elevator, sees me, starts praising me for a column I had written praising him, which he thought was particularly astute. But then a crowd gathers around Clinton because they see him there, and he starts backing up so they can all hear. And within a few minutes, he's like 80 feet away from me, just talking to me, but just embracing everybody. And if they don't naturally have these skills, they make sure they get them. So I was covering Mitt Romney the last presidential cycle, and he was up campaigning at a diner with his 5 perfect sons, bip, chip, rip, stip, dip, and lip. And he goes into a diner, and he introduces himself to each family at each table, says what village in New Hampshire are you from. Then he describes the home he owns in their village. And so he's going around the room. And at the end, he waves to everybody on the way out. And he then first names most of the people he's just met. And I was like, okay, that's the skills they have. And then just finally, the final illustration is I was up at the National Institutes of Health a couple weeks ago, and a scientist there showed me a video of a girl with Williams syndrome. And Williams syndrome from the outside looks like reverse autism. So this little girl, about 18 months old, she's in a room with a 12-year-old boy, and she doesn't care about the physical objects in the room. She has no interest in that. She just wants to look into his eyes and get social signals from him. And she gets real close to him, just stares at his eyes. Minute after minute, he finally has to back away. He can't take the intense attention. And I'm watching this video of this little girl, and I'm thinking, this is every senator I've ever interviewed. They all have that. And yet, so you take the most socially astute people on Earth, and then when you look at them actually in the public sphere, a lot of that seems to vanish. And in the public and political sphere, a lot of what you see there is people who have very subtle intonations, the ability to pick up delicate social signals. Suddenly when they're campaigning officially, you get these either accrued emotionalism, or else when they're in policy-making roles, you get almost a dehumanized view of human nature. And so I've covered a series of policies over the past 20 years, often of which the policies have failed because we had a dehumanized view of human nature. And so I covered the decline of the Soviet Union, the rise of Russia. We sent economists there with hard currency plans and privatization plans. And yet what Russia really lacked was social trust. And we were oblivious to that. Iraq, we sent to the military. Our leaders were oblivious to the cultural and psychological realities of Iraqi society after 30 years of Saddam's rule. We recently had a financial regulatory reform system, more or less based on the supposition that Bankers were rational, self-interested creatures who wouldn't do anything stupid en masse. And that turns out not to be true. And the subject I care about most is school reform. I've been covering education reform since 1983, the Nation at Risk report. And in those years, we've tried to reform the schools, usually with disappointing results, because we tried to restructure the bureaucratic boxes, big schools, little schools, charters, vouchers, and we skirted the core issue, which is the individual relationship between a teacher and a student. And the reality is that people learn from people they love, but if you mention the word love at a congressional hearing, they look at you like you're Oprah. It's just not a language we're comfortable with here. And so the question is, why are the most socially attuned people on earth so socially unattuned when they actually get in their policymaking roles? And I came to the conclusion eventually that this was a broader cultural problem, that we've inherited centuries back this view of human nature that we're divided selves, that reason is divided from the emotions, and that society progresses to the extent that reason, which is trustworthy, suppresses the passions which are untrustworthy. And so when we try to build policymaking structures or try to lead our own lives, we try to create a world in which passion is sort of is suppressed and reason takes over. And this has led to ways of seeing the world. It's led people to study human behavior in academic fields using the methodologies of physics, in which they value all the things they can count and model and sort of amputate all the rest. It's led to cultural effects that we're really good at talking about material things and material incentives and really bad at talking about emotions. It's led to a world, I think a moral world, in which we're really good at talking about practical things in life, or what we think are practical things, but we have, when it comes to the most important thing, which is what is character, how do you build it, we have nothing to say. And the philosopher Alistair McIntyre said we live in a world where we have the language, virtue, vice, honor, courage, but we don't have the system to understand all these moral qualities, how they fit together. And so this is the bias in our culture. And I think it's a philosophical bias, a policy bias. It affects us every day. If you go up to where I live out in Bethesda, you see the way people raise their kids, emphasizing grades, SAT, IQ scores, not really knowing how to talk about building relationships and building character. And so if you go up to the elementary school near where I live, you know, the kids are coming out of the third grade, and they've got these 80-pound backpacks on their back and loaded down with books. If the wind blows them over, they're like beetles, sort of stuck there on the ground. And in one of my books, I talk about them being picked up by all these luxury cars come to pick up the kids in Bethesda, the Saabs, Audis, and Volvos, because it's socially acceptable to have a luxury car so long as it comes from a country hostile to U.S. foreign policy. That's fine. And then I describe the people who come pick them up, though, I called Uber moms, who are highly successful career women who've taken time off to make sure all their kids get into Harvard. And you can tell the Uber moms because they actually weigh less than their own children. They're sort of doing little butt exercises at the time of conception, taking so many soy-based nutritional formulas that the babies plop out these 12-pound defensive linemen, and they're flashing Mandarin flashcards at the things, get them ready for the Harvard application. And then they have the style of parenting that many people ridicule but few actually renounce, which is the high-pressure, skill-enhancing style of oboe practice, soccer practice, tutoring, community service. And nobody really likes the style, but the Tiger moms are all doing it, and we feel we have to compete. And this is sort of the cultural breeze, emphasizing one set of traits, underemphasizing the other. And the other effect, just practically, and I've written about this sociologically, is that when it comes time to talk about morality, often we end up talking about shopping and things that are easier and more material to handle. And so I've written, God knows, a lot about people who try to shop in enlightened ways, people who go to Ben & Jerry's, the ice cream company that's own foreign policy. I joked in one of my books that Ben & Jerry's should make a pacifist toothpaste, doesn't kill germs, just ask them to leave. It would be a big seller. I think, and then I write a lot about Whole Foods or Trader Joe's, the sort of morally enlightened grocery stores where all the cashiers look like they're on loan from Amnesty International. What we buy there for my household, these seaweed-based snacks. There's one called Veggie Booty with kale, which is for kids who come home and say, Mom, I want a snack that'll help prevent colon rectal cancer. It's a big seller. And so these are sort of the biases in our culture, leading us away from some of the most important things. And yet, as I was doing some research and really reporting 7 or 8 years ago on the high school dropout rate, I came across a different body of research which ironically connected me back to the important things, the things that are skirted in this amputation. I've described this cultural amputation. And the odd thing is the realms of life that were leading me back to the important things were not theology and philosophy, which are really in charge of telling us of who we are, but they were people who study the mind. Neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, psychologists, sociologists, behavioral economics. And they've made such incredible strides over the last 30 years on who we are and what we are inside. And when you synthesize their views, I think you come back in field after field with three recurring foundational ideas. The first insight I think they brought us is that while the conscious mind writes the autobiography of our species, most of our thinking is actually below the level of awareness. It's unconscious thinking. And one way to symbolize this, it's a bit crude, but one scientist said the human mind can take in about 12 million pieces of information, of which it can be consciously aware of about 40. And so all the rest is happening without us really being aware of it. And so this leads to some peculiarities. My favorite one, a researcher at the University of Buffalo found out that people named Dennis are disproportionately likely to become dentists. People named Lawrence become lawyers because unconsciously we gravitate toward things that are familiar. My own daughter is named President of the United States Brooks for that reason. And they're also finding that a lot of these unconscious processes are surprisingly intelligent. And so one of the most cognitively demanding things any of us do is buy furniture. It's really hard to go to a furniture store and see a sofa and imagine what it's going to look like back home. And when you do that, you shouldn't really study it. They've studied how you should make this decision. You shouldn't really study it. You should immerse yourself in it, sort of get used to it, distract yourself, and then do it intuitively, because that level of your mind is more supple at this sorts of problem. Another bit of advice, practical advice, is if you have trouble making up your mind, flip a coin. Tell yourself you'll decide it on the basis of a coin flip, but don't go with what the coin says. Go with your emotional reaction to the coin flip. Are you happy or sad it came out a certain way? And that's your inner mind telling you what you really like. And so the first insight is the power of unconscious processes, and they're surprising intelligence. They're not perfect, God knows, but surprisingly intelligent. The second insight is that emotions are not separate from reason, but emotions are at the foundation of our thinking. So people who have suffered lesions or strokes that make it unable to process emotion are not super intelligent, they're super dumb. Because what the emotions do is they assign value to things. They tell us what we want and don't want. And if you don't have that valuation system, you really have no basis on which to make a decision. Your landscape is hopelessly flat. And so the emotions are really, we have this image in our head that it's a seesaw. If reason is up, then emotion is down, or vice versa. That's not true. Smarter emotions lead to smarter reason. And that's not something I'm comfortable talking about. I live in Washington, the most emotionally avoidant city on the face of the earth. I am a middle-aged white guy. My wife says me writing a book about emotions is like Gandhi writing a book about gluttony. It's not the normal thing I do. There's an apocryphal brain scan story I love telling. It's about they took a bunch of middle-aged guys, put them in an fMRI brain scan machine, had them watch a horror movie, and then had them describe their feelings toward their wives. And the brains were the same in both circumstances, just sort of sheer terror at both prospects. And that's not really true, but I relate to it. But the fact is, emotion really is at the center of how we think. Antonio Damasio, a great scientist in this field, said that in 1995, at the big neuroscience convention, there were no panels on emotion. But now half the panels are on emotion as we come to understand its centrality. And emotion literally builds the mind. It not only tells us what to value, it tells us what to remember, and it literally builds the connections in the mind. In 1945, there was a orphanage out west where they decided they would keep the kids antiseptic, no germs. So they gave them food, they treated them with good health care, but they did not handle the kids, they did not touch them. And so the mortality rate by age 2 was 37%. The kids died at such high rates, they stopped naming them. And that's because the actual affection is what builds the mind. And then the third insight is that we're not primarily self-contained individual creatures. We're deeply interpenetrated one with another. And so when we look at each other, we don't only theorize about what we're seeing. I reenact in my own mind what I see you doing. I reenact not only what you're doing, but the intentions behind your actions. There's just deep loops flowing through us all the time. And some of these are flowing visually, some of these are flowing in much deeper ways. And one story of research done in Germany, they took a bunch of people, this is another gauze pad thing, they put gauze pads under their arms, had some of them watch a horror movie, had some of them watch a comedy, got other research subjects to sniff the gauze pads later. And they could tell with great high rates, way above chance, who watched a comedy, who watched a horror movie, simply by the odors. And women were a lot better than men at this, by the way. But when you take these three foundational insights, this gives you a different vision, I think, of who we are. And so we're all inheritors, and I think the policy world, which I've been describing, is a descendant of the French Enlightenment of René Descartes, and the idea that reason is the highest of the faculties. But this research really vindicates, I think, the truth of a different Enlightenment, the British or Scottish Enlightenment, led by David Hume and Adam Smith and Edmund Burke, which said that reason is weak, but our sentiments, what they called our sentiments, what we would call our emotions, are strong and supple. And so it really leads you in that different direction, and I think it gives you a different view of many different fields, including, most dear to my heart, of human capital and social mobility. It reminds you of what are the traits that really lead to human capital and really lead to advancement. And we're used to telling a story about what leads to success, what leads to fulfillment in life. And we emphasize things like grades, SATs, degrees, year in school, and all that stuff is important. IQ is important. But this research points to other traits and other abilities which are at least equally important, or maybe more important, but which we're not really conscious of, not really aware of, and don't really emphasize, even though they are so important. And these traits are both emotional and rational, and make a hash of both those categories. So one trait quickly is a trait you might call mind sight, the ability to look into somebody else's mind and soak up what they have there. Babies come to us with this trait. So a researcher named Alan Meltzoff, in 1979, he leaned over a baby who was 43 minutes old, and he wagged his tongue at the baby, and she wagged her tongue back at him. And babies, even at a phenomenally young age, are built to really connect with others because that's how they're downloading information. They're phenomenally good at reading faces. So you can take 6 months old, show them a gallery of monkey faces, and the 6-month-old babies can tell one monkey from another. There's an ability we lose by adulthood because we don't really need to observe faces that closely. And so they're wired to do this. And in this country, about 55% of the kids by about 18 months have developed relationships with mom, especially mom or dad, and they've learned to download information. They've learned to establish a learning two-way communication relationship with mom, and these people are called securely attached by the researchers. And scientists at the University of Minnesota did a study of attachment patterns at 18 months old, and they found they could predict with 77% accuracy who was going to graduate from high school by looking at them at 18 months and how they related to mom. And that's because if you go to school with the ability to learn from adults, to establish relationships, you just have a huge advantage over people who don't have that ability. 20% of the kids are what they call avoidantly attached. They've been sending out signals, but nothing's been coming back. And so they don't have the right models in their heads. And there's a teacher in one of the books I read who described an avoidantly attached kid coming into a classroom like a sailboat tacking into the wind, wanting to get close to teacher, but not really knowing how. And emotionally avoidant kids with avoidantly attachments, they have less activation in the reward areas of their brains during social interaction. They get less of a kick out of social interaction. They have many fewer memories of their childhood because there was less that was emotionally vivid to them. And by age 70, they'll have many, many fewer friends. Now, nothing that happens at age 18 months determines a life course, but it opens up a pathway which could either be confirmed or disconfirmed by later experience. And so that's one of the traits that we either have or don't have, and you meet people who have this ability to just suck things out of you. I actually recently ran into Michael Milken in Los Angeles, who I hadn't met before, but he just lasers into you, and just everything you have, he's going to take it. It's kind of an impressive thing. The second trait I'll mention is equipoise, which is the serenity and maturity to monitor the biases and shortcomings in your own mind. And so we all tend to be overconfidence machines. 95% of college professors in America say they have above average teaching skills. 96% of college students have above average leadership skills. Time magazine recently asked people, are you in the top 1% of earners? and 19% of Americans are in the top 1% of earners, and 36% expect to be someday. Two researchers, Paul Schumacher and Edward Russo, gave executives tests about their own industries and asked them how confident you got the answers to the test right. So people in the advertising industry were confident they got 90% of the answers right. In fact, they got 60% of the answers wrong. The most overconfident industry is the computer industry, where the executives were sure they were correct 95% of the time. In fact, they were wrong 80% of the time. This is a strongly gender-linked trait, by the way. Men drown at twice the rate as women because men have tremendous confidence in their swimming abilities, especially after they've been drinking. But some people have traits, some people have these traits which are not really well correlated with IQ, but are the ability to self-monitor, what the scientists call metacognition. And so some people are open-minded in the face of ambiguity. They're curious when the evidence is uncertain. They adjust the strength of their conclusion to the strength of their evidence. They build modesty bootstraps for themselves to correct for their own ignorance. Peter Drucker had one that I like where he said, when you make a decision, seal your reasoning in an envelope for 9 months and then open it up. You'll find that a third of your decisions were right, a third were wrong, a third were in between, but in almost all cases your reasoning will be irrelevant at the end of the day. And so that's a way to remind yourself of how little you know. And these traits, a guy named Keith Stanovich at the University of Toronto measured, are these traits, these mental abilities related to IQ. And they are a little, but not a lot. The third trait we might call metis, which is a Greek word which we might call street smarts. And that's the ability to see a landscape and pick out the patterns that matter, to sort of intuitively know what will go together and what will not go together. I recently read a great book called The Wayfinders, which was about people who sailed hundreds of years ago from Indonesia to Hawaii without the aid of a compass. They didn't have compass. And they did it by, they had a guide on each boat who did nothing but observe the shape of the waves, the color of the water, the contours of the clouds, and by this sharp observation, they could sail across hundreds of miles of open ocean without getting lost. My newspaper did a great story about soldiers in Iraq in Baghdad who could look down the street and tell whether there was an IED, a landmine, on the street. And if you asked them, how do you know? They couldn't tell you. They would say, oh, I feel a coldness inside. And some people have this ability to be perceptive. The next trait you might call sympathy, the ability to work well in groups. And this is something we get from having experience with a social environment. And this is tremendously powerful because groups are just more powerful than individuals. And face-to-face groups are potentially much more powerful than any other kind. So at the University of Michigan, they did a study where they gave groups a math test, and some met face-to-face for 10 minutes. And the ones who met face-to-face did very well. Other groups met for 30 minutes, but they could only communicate by email. And those groups could not solve the math tests, math problems, because face-to-face we're just sending so many more signals than we are. So teleconferencing, something to be suspicious of. And so the effectiveness of the group was not determined by the IQ of the group, the highest IQ in the group. It was determined by how good people were at reading each other's emotional signals, how often they took turns while conversing. And if you want to know a group that is the dictionary definition of a dysfunctional group, go to the US Capitol. It's right there. And then two final traits. The one is propriety, the ability to build habits that will control some of your worst impulses. And the most famous bit of research in this whole field, and most of you probably know it, I've talked about it many times at Aspen, is the Marshmallow experiment by Walter Mischel. And just very quickly, this one's really famous, but Mischel took 4-year-olds, put them in a room, put a marshmallow in front of them, left the room and said, if you can eat this marshmallow now, but I'm going to come back in 10 minutes, and if you haven't eaten the marshmallow, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. And he shows me videos of the kids trying not to eat the marshmallows. There's a little girl banging her head on the table, trying not to eat the marshmallow. One day, Mischel uses an Oreo cookie, and a little guy picks up the Oreo, carefully eats out the middle, carefully puts it back on the table. That kid is now a U.S. senator. But the kids who go 8, 10, 12 minutes, 20 years later, much higher college completion rates. 30 years later, much higher incomes. The kids who pop it in their mouth right away, much higher drug and alcohol addiction problems. 20 years later, much higher incarceration rates. And that's because some kids grow up in homes where actions lead to consequences, and they develop strategies to control your impulses. And they do it by seeing the marshmallow in a different way. They pretend the marshmallow is a cloud. They put a frame around the marshmallow. They just have strategies to help them see it differently. And so one of the things I think Aristotle knew, but the science confirms, which is you change your mind by changing your behavior. You establish habits. And then those habits, like etiquette, get you in the certain patterns. And those patterns are reinforced in your mind. And then when the big temptations come along, you have a better mental landscape to resist them. Alcoholics Anonymous intuited this. They have the phrase, fake it until you make it. And that's behavior changing the mind. And then the final trait I'll mention, which I think is the most important, is something in the book I call limerence, which is not really an ability, but more of a motivation, more of a drive. The conscious mind really wants to, seeks hungers for food and success and fame and money and all that sort of stuff. But what the unconscious mind seems to want most of all is those moments when the inner patterns and the outer patterns match. When the skull line falls away and you're lost in the challenge of a task, what a naturalist feels lost in nature, what a believer feels when enveloped by God's love, or what lovers feel when they're completely consumed by love for one another. And this thing we're learning about, this drive to merge with each other and to lose self-consciousness, is something we're learning a lot about. And the decision to fall in love is not unlike every other decision we make. It's not a separate category of decision. It's the same sort of decision-making process we use over and over again. Partly it's sort of rational and logical. So we tend to marry people with similar nose widths to our own, with eyes similarly apart. We marry people with complementary immune systems, which we tell by scent and by saliva. We tend to marry people with as much status as we can get our hands on. And so women, unfortunately, tend to prefer taller guys. The average inch of height in the United States translates to about $6,000 a year of average annual income. But I saw an online study by Dan Ariely, who found that on online dating sites, a guy who's 5'6" could get as many online date offers as a guy who's 6 foot, so long as he makes $172,000 a year more. So that's. But part of it, of course, is not what we would call logical. Stendhal has a great phrase called crystallization. And he describes some salt mines in Austria where the miners would throw branches into a hole and dig them up 2 weeks later, and the branches would come back covered in crystals, and they'd hold them up to light, and they would shimmer beautifully in the light. And he said, that's what we do to our beloved. We surround them with crystals and imagine them in a much more lovely circumstances than maybe we are. And that's a way that emotion really changes the perceptions of ourselves. And so the process of falling in love is not only this calculation of genetic transmission, it's also this enchanted process. And that's really gets back to the core of all this, that a lot of this research is done in the labs at NIH and other places, but it really reminds us of a more enchanted way of looking at the world, a humanistic way of looking at the world. It reminds us of the importance of art and music and stories to educate the emotions, to give us a wider emotional repertoire. And it reminds us how interpenetrated we are. And finally, the passage that I came across that really summarized a lot of this for me was in a book called I Am a Strange Loop by a scientist at Indiana University named Douglas Hofstadter. And Hofstadter is a brain scientist and theorizes about how the brain works. But he was also married to a woman named Carol. And they were on sabbatical in Italy, and their kids were 5 and 2 at the time when Carol got a stroke and died very suddenly. And months later, he had a photo of Carol on the bureau of his bedroom. And he was just walking through his bedroom one day, and he happened to look at the photo. And he had the following sensation, which he describes in this book, I'm a Strange Loop. This is Hofstadter writing. I looked at her face, and I looked so deeply that I felt I was behind her eyes. And all at once I found myself saying as tears flowed, that's me, that's me. And those simple words brought back many thoughts that I had had before, about the fusion of our souls into one higher level entity, about the fact that at the core of both our souls lay our identical hopes and dreams for our children, about the notion that those hopes were not separate or distinct hopes, but were just one hope, one clear thing that defined us both, that welded us into a unit, the kind of unit I had but dimly imagined before being married and having children. I realized that though Carol had died, that core piece of her had not died at all, but that it had lived on very determinedly in my brain. Now, the Greeks used to say we suffer our way to wisdom, and the wisdom that Hofstadter suffered his way to was the notion that we are deeply interpenetrated one to another, and the loops in our minds are shared loops that flow from us unconsciously all the time and make us who we are. And in a more shallow way, the policy failures of the last 30 years have reminded us, I think, that a view of human nature which amputates a lot of this unconscious flow, this conversations between us at the deeper level. We'll have an imperfect view of how people behave, and it will arrive at imperfect solutions, and it'll lead to policy failures. And the good news, I think, for me, it's been exciting to be around these researchers and to try to report upon what they do, in part because next to my world, they're models of intellectual integrity, actually. They really are persuaded by the evidence, which often doesn't happen in my normal world. But also because they, even though they're scientists, and I'm not sure how many English courses they took, they are leading us toward a re-enchanted and rehumanized way of seeing ourselves. And I think the work they're having is going to have huge cultural effects for decades to come. So thank you very much. Some of the research I saw at NYU recently, they took Chinese Americans, had them watch a video of a Chinese American suffering, and then had them watch a video of other groups suffering. And when we see someone in our own group suffering, we feel it, and the brain lights up. When we see another group suffering, we sort of care. So there's deep tribal things built into us. And there's something called Project Implicit online, where they force you to do an online test where you look at people of other races, and they gauge your instant reactions. And the results are not pretty. We make these distinctions. But one of the effects of dividing between in-group and out-group is we tend to separate and perceive each other through the prism of our group dynamic. And so I'd say when we cover Capitol Hill, we have people who define each other by groups very powerfully. And once you pick a group, which you do on the basis of nobody decides their politics on the basis of who has the best health care plan. They decide which group is filled with people more like myself. Social identity comes first, and then ideology comes second. And once you've chosen a social identity and proven a group, then you filter your perception of reality through that prism. So Larry Bartels at Princeton did research where he asked people in the Reagan years, did inflation increase or decrease? Now, objectively, inflation decreased during the Reagan years. But Democrats said no, it increased, because that made them feel better. And then during the Clinton years, he asked Republicans, did unemployment come down or increase during Bill Clinton's term? And they all said, no, it went up, even though objectively it went down. And so we filter reality through this tribal prism, and we get what we get, which is Capitol Hill. And just one final thing, I could go on to this for hours, but you know, one of the things that bugs me at the moment is that two people in this town who really should have conversations and would get along really well are Barack Obama and Paul Ryan.
It's astonishing that they haven't talked since election.
Right, and so I've asked people at the White House, why don't you do that? And they said, well, it's protocol. We'd have to call in Boehner, we'd have to call in Pelosi. And so they treat a member of Congress as if he was a foreign country, and they have to go through all this rigmarole. And I'm not sure if that's a rationalization or a reason, but they have not had a conversation.
But the opposite with your guy, Bill Clinton, you were talking about.
Right.
I mean, he couldn't stop hanging with Newt Gingrich when he served his purpose.
I'll tell one story of this. This is, well, it's not off the record, but I'll tell it anyway. There's a camera back there. This was a reporter was in the White House interviewing somebody for a story, and the president happened to walk into the office. He said, the reporter said, Mr. President, since you're here, can I just ask you two quick questions? I want to nail these things down. This is Obama. And Obama said, no, I don't think so, I shouldn't do that, and he left. And then the reporter recognized that he'd had a similar thing happen with Bill Clinton was president, and he'd stayed there till 3 in the morning getting the answers.
Neuroscience, how to figure out his next moves. But I chose one question, which was you had to know that the audience would have a reaction to the color of the tie you chose. And I wondered what you were looking for.
I do tell my kid, I have a son who's 12, and I say, wear a lot of pink, especially at that age, girls will like you'll be like a magnet. But no 12-year-old boy's masculinity is secure enough to wear a pink tie. But I actually haven't done research into colors. I should, or I haven't followed the research on the colors. But basically, my only view is that I'm going to be on the NewsHour tonight. And if you wear a dark blue shirt, you really should wear something hot on top of it. That's because the NewsHour is such a visual show. People have high demand.
That's really short.
Yeah. In the back there.
Thank you. It's possible that the work you're doing will contribute to a social wave, and which will help legislators and government officials and so on, and all of us be more thoughtful in our actions. The problem is that as far as Congress goes, we may not have time, for that social wave to come into effect. And I was wondering, sort of, how do you envision, or how would you envision, if you thought about practical applications that might help members of Congress increase their emotional IQ?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they all have it. Like I said, the question is getting out of the mentality that says, well, let me say one thing. I try with this dumb quota system, where if I interview a Republican, I try to interview a Democrat, just 1-to-1, just because to keep my world balanced. And I'll tell you one thing I have noticed is that whenever a politician starts telling me about what the other party is doing, I know that everything I'm about to hear is probably going to be false. They just don't know much about what the other side is thinking, and they imagine things about the other side. They imagine the other side is very ruthless and very professional, and that their own side is chaotic and disorganized. They're both half right about that, by the way, now that I think about it. Both sides are chaotic and disorganized. But a lot of it comes from just having sort of a normal Paul Ryan, Barack Obama conversation. That would be one thing. The second thing, and this is more social than political, to me the most important polling statistic in politics is, do you trust government to do the right thing most of the time? And it was like 70% through much of the 20th century, and now it's down about 19%. It's about a historic low. And so it's very hard to ask people to sacrifice to, say, restrain the debt, or to pay higher taxes or accept lower benefits, when they assume that I'll be asked to sacrifice, but other people are going to get off scot-free because they have no faith in the system. And so reestablishing those bonds of trust, of social trust, is important. And that's one of the things that research constantly reminds you of, that it's usually a mistake to look at individual traits. It's generally important to look at the quality of relationships between people and the quality of the relationship between the government and its citizens. And so to me, it's made me more communitarian. It's made me think that building community bonds is just much more important. We've had such individualistic movements both in the 60s and the 80s. We've overdone it with individual freedom. We have to work on community a little more. Yeah. Matt?
Communicating only with computers and not with people.
Well, Facebook is a bad substitute for face-to-face. Actually, Zuckerberg is an interesting case because he's a geek, but his social needs were so high that he understood how to build the technology for social insecurity. He put the relationship status up there. And he's sort of a genius in that way. I have two thoughts about this generation, which are incompatible. The first thought is, if you look at the social indicators that went south in the 60s and 70s and stayed really bad for the next 20 or 30 years, they're all moving in the right direction. So teenage pregnancy is down a third, domestic violence is down 50%, crime is down 7%, teenage suicide is down, drug use is down, community service is up. This, on the one level, is an incredibly wholesome generation and hardworking and responsible. They're all going to have the biggest midlife crisis in human history in about 10 years. But up until that moment, incredibly impressive. The second thing I would say, though, and this is that there's been a lot to remind them of how special they are. And there has been this expansion of self. I wrote a column about this last week, just one polling statistic from that. In 1950, the Gallup organization asked people, are you a very important person? And 12% said yes. In 2005, or when they asked it again, it wasn't 12% said I'm very important, it was 80%. And so there's been different attitude about who I am and what I deserve. And so that's a shift toward what some people would call narcissism. But I would say in general, just finally I'm rambling, but there's a debate over is Facebook killing face-to-face relationships or merely supplementing them. And I tend to think the evidence suggests supplementing. But that's not definitive.
Totally
Sir?
right.
As a fellow reporter, I'd be interested in hearing you talk about sort of how do you take this research and apply it to thinking your way through a public policy issue. Just take, for example, the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind. How does this help you arrive at a, I guess for lack of a better phrase, a journalistic conclusion about, you know, what the policy outcome ought to look like?
Yeah, well, just, you know, I found personally that now in my columns, I find I write a lot of my columns very differently than I would have before. And so when I look at the Middle East, I look at the emotional contagion sweeping through the Middle East. And so when I look at education, No Child Left Behind, I find myself a little skeptical of the people whose side I'm on. And what I mean by that is a lot of the people I admire most in the Mischel, Arnie Duncan, Joel Klein camp emphasize testing and accountability and reading and math and rigor. And I think they're absolutely right to do that. But I do worry that we are underplaying with the testing and the accountability a lot of the things that actually do educate the emotions. And so those are things like art and music. And I ran into an educator and asked him, you know, what keeps kids in school? And he said it's the ABCs, athletics, band, and cheerleading. And so it makes me think that as we cut budgets, if we're going to cut math and music and art, and we're going to cut athletics, we're cutting those things that attach students emotionally to schools, and that we should be very careful of that sort of thing. And so that
I just note that I heard
very popular.
Huckabee 4 years ago give an absolutely inspirational campaign speech about that very issue.
Yeah.
About the importance of sort of integrating the notion of what an ideal curriculum would look like to emphasize those very things.
Right. And I would say I agree absolutely with that. And I would say the two groups that I found are more naturally have been speaking this way have in a sense been disrespected by the establishment. And one of those groups is sort of on the left, sort of new agey, or psychologists who are used to talking this way, and psychologists have too little influence on public policy. And the second group is social conservatives who are used to talking this way. And this one other thing you remind me of, Huckabee gave a great speech about childhood obesity. And I remember he said, go to an elementary school, look at the picture of the third grade class, and then look at a picture from 30 years ago, and what do you notice? And you would cover those events, and the crowds would be rapt. And I would guess that most senators would not talk that way about that subject because they think, oh, that's not what I do. I do budgeting, I do arms control. But childhood obesity it had people. So it's the bias toward we tend to have a staticism that privileges issues that deal with guns and banks. It seems more manly, but the other stuff is more important.
I read your book. I enjoyed every page.
Oh,
It reassessed some of the suspicions I had, for instance, that marshmallows do cause drug addiction. It is written in a style that is bound up in some metaphors and similes. Technical books that do that, specifically those that are written about quantum mechanics and comparative biology and such, one has the confidence that there's deep science underneath those similes and metaphors.
Right.
I'm left with not the same comfort here. Are you?
Well, I guess the one thing I'd say a couple things. I don't do any of the research myself. I'm a journalist, and I cover them. And so I try to cite the important people in the field, and if you've read the book, you know there are hundreds of people cited at each page. I maybe oversight because I'm really relying on their work. And the second thing, and this I discovered about myself, I'm not a science writer. And so while I'll cite people like Damasio or Michael Gazzaniga or Jonathan Haidt at UVA, various people at NIH and around the world, I found I couldn't, and it really wasn't part of my job, to write about the mechanisms that they spent a lot of time investigating. So my goal in the book was to have the word amygdala not appear in it. And the amygdala is the region that processes emotion and other things. But I didn't want to get lost in the how the brain works, what region of the brain is doing what, how the synapses are or what's happening across the synapses. And so I didn't want to get lost in that scientific detail, that's the mechanism of science. My book is about the social implications and cultural implications of the work. And so the things I did was, A, I tried to rely on the major experts in the field. B, I hired a professional to read it over and correct me when I was going astray. But I would say still the hardest thing for me, and I did not do this perfectly, was hew to the center of the field, play it safe. And so one of the things you want to do, there's always a range of disagreements in any subject area. I tried to be down the middle, but it's very hard to get an objective view of where the field is. And the area where I had the most difficulty was in the area of IQ, the effect of IQ. And so I think most scientists would agree that IQ explains about 25% of the variation in job performance. But there are some who think it's much more powerful and some who think it's a lot less powerful. And it's very hard to navigate a field that's so hotly disputed. And I probably erred too much on the side of downplaying the role of IQ in the book. If I had to go back, I'd probably rewrite that a little. But again, it's trying to get it down the middle and just report on the outcomes of what they're researching, not the details of how different brain regions are talking to one another or whatever. In the back there, we'll do one and then two.
Yeah, thank you. I also enjoyed your book very much. I had to read it at the speed of light, but I'm glad to be here. I'm concerned about cognitive research making the same mistake that medical research made for many years, which was that all the experiments were conducted by hyper-educated white men on other white men, and from there they derived deduced that this was how people were, when in fact they weren't measuring women, for one thing, so they were leaving out half of the population, and the results of their research were flawed. We've subsequently learned that you need to study both men and women in medicine. Now, in psychology, which is very much an American field, as it grows, my question is, when you say we, this is how we think, do you mean we Americans? Do you mean we white male middle class Americans? Because has this research been done on more than just American people, so that when we say we, are we really talking about people globally? Just how much can this cognitive research be generalized to the global we?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would say there has been a move in the last 5 or 10 years where they've come, especially in psychology departments, more so than in neuroscience, they've come to the awareness that the vast majority of their research subjects are college students. And so that may not be representative. And so I think they've made efforts to correct for that. But then just on the globalization, I think this is less of a worry. One of the things you find when you interview so many of these people is that they're from all over the world. And now some of them work here because this is where most of the money is, but not all. There's the neuroscience community is a global research community. And so I mentioned Damasio's Portuguese, Marco Iacoboni who's Italian. This complicated concept or controversial concept of mirror neurons was discovered in Italy first and now is being worked on all over the world. And they're now actually beginning to do studies where they do simultaneous fMRI scans in the US and in China. The Chinese are very involved in this work. So my perception is that people in different parts of the world, the Germans do a lot of this work, the Dutch, they have different interests. There might be different interests. But my sense for the field is that they really do communicate very well globally. And so the work that's being done is global in nature. And I'd invite anybody to go up to NIH and see who's there. And the other thing, final thing to be said is how modest they are. And I mentioned how inspiring it is for me to go up over to NIH or places like that and to see people who've really been humbled by the complexity of what they're doing. I spoke to some behavioral geneticists, and that field, they thought they were going to be able to use genes to link it to behavior. And then they got up to a certain point of understanding, and they realized it's way more complicated than we thought, so we're going to start here. And I asked one of them, I said, what have you learned in the course of your career? And he said, I thought we'd really understand this stuff in my lifetime, and I no longer really think that. And so I think they're very aware of their own limitations. They spend a lot of their time really criticizing themselves. And the back, sir.
Thank you. I enjoyed your discussion of various professions and the self-confidence exhibited by those professionals. But how would you reconcile, or what conclusions would you draw about that and the comment you made about Congresspeople vis-a-vis the professionalism and organization of their political parties?
Yeah, well, I think politicians are, I would say they're in the self-confident mold. Though I would say, I find they are secretly a little aware of their weaknesses, but are not allowed to say that. And I remember this was a big issue with President Bush, where he was asked, have you made any mistakes? And if you remember this famously in a debate in the re-election campaign, he said in public, well, he wouldn't answer the question. But after the debate, he went right up to the woman who asked it, and he said, I want you to know, of course, I made mistakes, but I can't say that. And I think that is genuinely true. And when you speak to, this is the big difference when you speak off the record. We have a dispute in the newspaper business, should we do off-the-record interviews or not? And I'm a big believer in off-the-record interviews, especially for columnists, because you really do get a different version. And I always ask people, what have you learned in government that you didn't know before? And you'll get very humble answers. One former president told me there was a lot more passive-aggressive behavior in government than I understood at the time, that I give an order and nothing happens. And another person said, I thought when you were in charge of an agency and you had ideas for what that agency should do, you would have some influence in getting that agency to enact those ideas. And so I think there's doubt, self-doubt in the population, but which can't officially manifest itself. On that, ma'am.
Hi, I'm originally from Albania, from the Balkans. So in our part of the world, we act on emotions. So the conscience is the second thing. And I read your columns religiously, primarily because you touch on this, this kind of subject. I was curious to know, when you came up with the idea to write this book, did you intuitively know that this is what happens, that we are propelled from emotionally and from our social skills, and then you went on to find research to support that? Right. Or you just started, reading and researching, and then you said, okay, let's see where it brings us?
Right. Well,
and just one observation, you said that you're not a touchy-feely person yourself in your introduction. Well, you did us a great favor to touchy-feely people to kind of put in words what we knew intuitively. So
maybe
thank
this
you.
Is like Ted Williams was a really bad hitting coach because he was really good at it. He couldn't explain it to people. So I would say what you describe is called confirmation bias. And no one, and I would be foolish to think I was immune from it. We all pick out the facts that confirm our worldviews. I will say a couple things. One, I was and remain extremely uncomfortable talking about emotion. And some of the response I got from my friends is, oh, you're having a midlife crisis if you're writing about this stuff. You must be a total wreck. And I think I'm not. I may be, but I think I'm not. I think I just went there because that's where the evidence leads. And I'm still not comfortable writing about emotion. I do this Friday show with E.J. Dionne, whom many of you know. And E.J. is the biggest hugger in the world. And he's naturally effusive. Believe me, I'm not. And so I wrote about emotion and somewhat against my grain, I think. And the second thing, and this is just ancillary, I think it did change my mind about several subjects. One of them, my last book, was about far-flung suburbs, really a celebration of suburbs. And I think when you do this work, you really appreciate the importance of density. There's a study of people who do patent work. And when you submit a patent, you list all the other patents that contributed to your innovation. And an amazing number of those lists include patents of people who live within 25 miles of the inventor. We learn from people right around us. And city workers have their productivity rates increase faster than suburban workers because they benefit from face-to-face meetings like this one. And so that's changed my view of suburbia. And then, I mentioned I'm much more communitarian than I was. So I think it's had some things that are not purely confirmation bias. But to be honest, I was an admirer of Edmund Burke and before all this. And I was an admirer of the Scottish Enlightenment before all this. And perhaps one of the reasons I was drawn to the work is because it does sort of confirm their worldview. And Ben Franklin, yeah. And I don't know where Einstein fits in. I do, now that I think about the wise men, I'm trying to think where they would fit. I will say that, well, I don't want to go back through your whole oeuvre, but I do think that generation, you should talk about this. I do think they had a character model. When they came to leadership roles, they were educated in a way where they had certain codes of character and leadership styles by reading Plutarch or whatever. I think in your book, John McCloy, his dad said, make John learn Greek or something.
Yeah.
And so I think we've lost some of that. One of the paradoxes since those guys were in power, we have a much fairer system for determining who's going to lead the society, but trust in our leadership has gone down, not up. So I would remember from that book the real power of leadership, training leaders. Oh, yeah.
You spoke about early development from birth to about 18 months as a determining factor. How do you feel the genetic makeup plays in a person's personality and character? A person can have two children, give them the same type of love, the same type of communication skills. One turns out to be gregarious, and one turns out to be a shrinking violet. How much would you say that our genetic makeup accounts for?
Genes play a role, but they only play a role through interaction with environment. Genes are designed to respond to certain interactions. And so one of the things that will happen is a research, I can't remember if it's Eric Kandel or not. No, it's Kagan. He measured temperament, measured how kids reacted to stress and surprise at a phenomenally early age, and then followed them through life. And some kids were categorized as very high stress reactors, wanted to take risks, also all these measurements of really temperament at a very early age. And what he found was that temperament is a leash, but it allows for variation. So if you're say on the desirability to take risks, your willingness to take risk, if you start over on this edge of the continuum, later in life you move to the middle. You may move to the middle, or you may stay off on this edge. It's very unlikely you'll move all the way over to the other side. And so genes play a role in determining our underlying temperament, but it's not a chain, it's a leash that allows movement depending on later experience. And so the other thing I think is true, a woman, I won't go deep into it, but the way we interact with our kids is not solely up to us, it's up to them too. And so if they have a certain temperament, we may have two kids in the back seat of the car, but we're going to react to them differently depending on their own temperament. And so some of the scientists have this thing called shared environment. I don't think there is any such thing as shared environment. They may be in the same car, but they're getting different versions of mom and dad. And so that's the two-way communication. Genes play this important role, but through the interaction. Okay.
With your understanding of people's behavior and neuroscience, what do you think is the likelihood that this Jasmine revolution is grassroots versus being manipulated by some other group?
Yeah. I guess I would say there are some things the neuroscientists can't tell us. That might be one of them. The only thing I'll say about that is a lot of the work really is about emotional contagions. It's about how things sweep through populations, things like stress, depression, obesity, and revolutions. I do think they sweep through societies, and we create these waves of emotion. I think that's what's happened. Okay,
in your interview with Charlie Rose, which can be seen actually online, you went into some detail about the allegorical nature of the structure of the book.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you'd given any thought to getting a television producer to look at that and do some programs.
Yeah, I'm going to do that after that over here with Ted Stevens.
We have Stevens here. Who will do it.
Well, I guess the one thing I had said was that it's not really a novel, because when a novelist sits down, I create these characters to sort of exemplify these research findings. When a novelist sits down, they try to create idiosyncratic characters you'll remember for all time, and they let their imagination wander. My characters exist for only one reason: to exemplify the research. So far from being idiosyncratic, I want them to be quintessential.
By the way, why did you do it that way?
Well, I did it for 3 reasons. One, I'm not an academic. I'm really bad at thinking about abstractions. I need examples. And so this gave me a way to do examples. Second, I just thought it'd be more fun to read. And third, if the research shows us that information hits us on various levels, I wanted the book to hit people both as evidence and also as story on various levels. And it was a big risk, and believe me, I thought long and hard, because I don't pretend to be a novelist. And some people have liked it, and some people have not liked it. And so I still think I made the right call in putting it in the words of characters. It was a lot more fun to write, among other things. But I did it that way. But I didn't pretend that my characters were going to be like novel characters. They're supposed to be allegorical characters. And that's the inevitable tension of doing it this way. Okay, maybe I don't know if we have time. I will say one quickly thing about that is, I mentioned in the foreword or introduction, Rousseau, of course, famously did Emile this way. But I actually came across a book in my parents' house, and it was a book of a travelogue of New York written in the 1890s, and it was done in the guise of a woman just walking around New York. And there was a scene in that book where she's walking down Columbus Avenue, and she sees a guy drinking a beer, and a cop comes up to the guy and says, "If you want to drink a beer, you have to walk on Amsterdam Avenue. At Columbus, we don't drink a beer." And I love that detail, that sort of vividness, and so that was an influence.
I know that your book doesn't cover theology and philosophy, but I am curious in your research if you found yourself informed differently, or really in any way, around if theology, worldview, philosophy strikes to reason or to emotion.
Yeah, well, just on theology, there are now a zillion books on the relationship between what we know of the brain and what it teaches us about theology. And one of the guys I recommend is a guy named Andrew Newberg, who was at Penn, is now at Thomas Jefferson Hospital, and he puts religious people, monks and nuns, in brain scan machines while they're in states of religious ecstasy. And what he discovers is the part of the brain that sort of controls our awareness of our own body, where it is, it sort of shuts down a little. And so you lose a sense of self in those moments. But like so much of the research, that doesn't solve the essential questions of, it just gives us the mechanism. But we knew there was bound to be a brain mechanism one way or the other. So I don't think a lot of this research really solves the essential questions of the nature of God or the existence of God. I do think to me, this is more personal, to me it did open up a location where God's creativity, if it exists, where it is. And that is the barrier between the physical meat of the brain and the emotional output, that mind-spirit barrier. And we have no idea, and people, this is the Moby Dick of brain research, how does emotion and spirit come out of meat? And we have no idea how that happens, but they're trying. But I do think the process where, even in the form of rat pups, when a rat mom licks her pup, the brain connections will be much thicker when it's licked, when it's shown some affection. And so how does a love change the physical wiring in a brain? That we don't understand, but that would be where God's creativity would be, I would think, in that junction. Yeah. Maybe last one. Okay, one more, quick one.
Other than writing your columns, how has writing this book most changed your own behavior?
Well, if you ask my wife, we were in the car the other day, and we were out going to go walk the dog at Scott's Run. I highly recommend Scott's Run if anybody knows Virginia. And I went out to the car to load something into the GPS system for later in the day, and I went out and left her behind with the dog. And so she sat down and said, "Okay, Mr. Emotionally Sensitive, what am I thinking right now?" And So I said, "You're pissed off at me," and I was right. I got that one right. So I wouldn't say it's made me Mr. Touchy-feely, to be perfectly honest, but I think I'm more aware. And then the other thing is a lot of the research really highlights, and this isn't new to anybody in this room, what leads to happiness and what doesn't. And so the activity that leads most to happiness, the daily activity, is going out to dinner with friends. The daily activity that detracts most from happiness is commuting. And so try to live close in. That's good advice. Well, the other, right. The other thing, I can't remember if I said this, but if you're dating someone, you should startle them, because their startle response will tell you a lot about their underlying temperament. That's another practical bit of advice. Okay, finally, sir.
I was wondering if you could comment on, you've said how important social capital and relationships are into being effective, with trust both inside and outside of government at historic lows. It strikes me we're at a fundamental shift in media. People are self-selecting media that conforms to their view. And it seems to me to be almost a slippery slope. If you can comment on whether there are mechanisms that could help build trust, both within government and within the public at large.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can think of some just mechanisms. I'd like to see an open primary. I'd like to see them change the voting schedule on Capitol Hill so they stay some weekends. Back to some of the old system. I'd like to see less redistricting. But I fundamentally think it'll take just a different character of leaders. The leadership in both parties have an incentive to encourage tribalism because it makes it easier to control their caucuses. But if you have more leaders that will allow more heterodox behavior, I think that'll have a world of effects, because most of the politicians I interview don't like the system they're trapped in. As for the media, it is certainly true that, frankly, radio and TV have a strong polarizing effect. But I saw a good study by some University of Chicago economists on internet traffic. They followed people as they surfed the web. And it's so easy to click over from one site to another. They found that people were leaving their ideological homes much more quickly on the internet. And conservatives were going to liberals were going to conservative sites much more than any other media form, just because it's so easy. And so that is sort of a hopeful note, maybe upon which to end.
David, I said that you embodied and exemplified what we do at Aspen. I was trying to think what I meant by that, but I realized that the intersection of values and character and leadership is what we always have tried to work on. That's exactly what you've tried to work on and what this book is about. For those of you involved in Aspen, you'll be happy to know that Harold and Erica have a house in Aspen.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
you have to get 2/3 of the way through the book to find it, but it's worth going through the book. To say that is that the book's on sale and you'll sign it.
I will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.